you realize it was actually going to be a scary film at this point, which Godzilla films aren't always scary. It reminded me of Jurassic Park in a lot of ways. I look over my son and he's like, wow, this is like a horror film.
Godzilla is not the Godzilla that you may be thinking at that point.
A giant foot coming down may be less scary than something that is individually going after you.
It had a perfect Rotten Tomatoes score.
I really liked the characters. It has a really good story.
It had been labeled a masterpiece.
Hi, I'm Heath Firestone with Cinema Technica.
And I'm Marc Loftus with Post Magazine. And in this podcast, we're going to discuss the new feature film, Godzilla Minus One. Heath, you and I have both been eagerly anticipating this film, and we finally got to see it even before its official release here in the U.S.
Right. This is one that my son made me promise that we would actually do a video on. And while I'm kind of a fan of Godzilla, my son is a huge fan of Godzilla. So he's been one of my main resources for understanding, which movies are referenced in this and everything else. And he made sure to fill me in on a lot of that.
Heath, do we want to look at some of the film's footage?
Yeah. Okay, so that gives you a taste of this movie. Now let's talk about it. We weren't able to make it to a press screening because they really didn't have press screenings, but you did go to a special screening. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I got a special invite to Japan Societies in New York City, and they call themselves the premier organization for connecting Japanese art, culture, business, and society with audiences in the New York area. They have a beautiful facility there. They have a 200-seat theater. It was a great experience, and the crowd, as much as it was press, was very excited to see it.
Yeah, and we got to see the fan-only event, which was yesterday, so not as much advanced viewing as you got, but before the official release anyway. So yeah, I was super excited about this for a lot of reasons. One of the things I do have to say about this film, it was a lot better than I expected it to be. and
Interesting.
That's coming from somebody who likes them. Do you have any initial thoughts?
I agree that it was very cinematic. You think of, a Godzilla type film, and you don't necessarily picture it being this, cinematic experience with a widescreen. It was shot in 2.39 to 1 aspect ratio. It had Dolby Atmos sound. So it was really presented to you in a cinematic experience. And I felt it was a little different than some of the previous releases, the more Americanized Godzillas that we saw, I guess, in 2019 and going back to 2014. And I enjoyed that aspect of it.
Yeah, I did too. What really surprised me is, Godzilla films aren't generally known for their story and their well-developed, I guess, character-driven plots. And this one actually really was. I really liked the story a lot. I thought it was really well developed. The characters were complex. You really cared about the characters, which isn't always the case in Godzilla movies. If you're enjoying this, please like and subscribe and check out our website, cinematechnica.com.
And visit postmagazine.com, where we cover filmmaking on a regular basis. Why don't we start with a little bit of a setup of how they introduce the audience to the concept that we're talking about here. It's taking place post-war, post-World War II. Japan has obviously just lost the war. They've been demilitarized. They're at their weakest right now. We understand that Godzilla may have made an appearance and destroyed San Francisco. So there is a little bit of a history there. You want to pick up on your thoughts?
Yeah. So the name comes from, it's called Godzilla Minus One because this is post World War II. Japan is at their lowest point possible, so they're at a level 0 or whatever. It doesn't get any lower than this, and then they get ultimately attacked by Godzilla, which is meaning they're even lower than 0, so they're -1. At least that's my understanding of where the name came from. And we actually follow the main character was a kamikaze pilot who shirked his duties. I guess he basically froze up, and instead of going in and doing a suicide mission, he actually fakes that his plane was not in working order and lands at a repair base. And everybody there kind of knows that he did that, and while he's there, they end up being attacked by Godzilla. Now, this is what was fascinating about this initial scene, is it really, you realize it was actually going to be a scary film at this point, which Godzilla films aren't always scary, but this one, kind of really reminded me of Jurassic Park in a lot of ways, kind of the T-Rex or the raptor scenes, where you felt like you were in it and you felt like you were in danger. You definitely felt like you were with them. And so I don't know, to me, that was like, wow, okay. I look over my son and he's like, wow, this is like a horror film.
That was an
I'm like,
interesting scene because Godzilla is not the Godzilla that you may be thinking at that point. He's still developing. So he's not this, building crushing type of monster at that point. So it does give you a little bit of a preface as to the evolution of it. And when I initially heard the title Godzilla Minus One, I almost thought that's what the reference was to, was that it's not 1.0, but prior to that, before he becomes the monster that we all know him as.
well, sure, and he is a lot smaller in that initial scene, so it is more like dinosaur size, not Godzilla size, but it's every bit as scary. I mean, maybe even more because it's a little more personal. You're more down on that same level, as I don't know, if for some reason a giant foot coming down may be less scary than something that can actually see you and is individually going after you. So yeah. I don't know, that was a departure for me from what I was expecting, but in a good way. I mean, it was like I say, very, very reminiscent of a Jurassic Park type of scene.
So that's where we meet our lead character, Kiyoshi. He's the kamikaze pilot, and he lands on this island, and then he returns back to Japan, and Japan has been devastated, and he is labeled a coward because he's showing up in Japan, and they know he was a pilot, and they figure if you're alive, you've obviously shrugged your duties. So he is really looked down upon at that point.
Yeah, and he has a lot of survivor's guilt. So this is where the character becomes kind of more interesting because he's not just this simple one-dimensional character. He knows he wanted to. I think he wanted to go off and fight, but he froze up. And there's a scene in the first meeting with Godzilla on that island where he also freezes up and he feels responsible for the deaths of people. And you can tell he wants to be a good guy, but he's having a really hard time. I think, that survivor's guilt and feeling guilty, like he's responsible for a lot of people's death and a lot of other things. So I don't know. To me, he's an interesting character, and that's really interesting characters.
Yeah, and that's really what the story is in this Godzilla film. It's Kiyoshi's story of, being labeled a coward, trying to overcome that, trying to make good on it and win back some kind of love of his home country. And Godzilla is in there, but there is a bigger storyline to it. And that's what you bring up, that you don't typically think of a Godzilla movie as having one of those deep storylines, but that is how they express it in this case.
Well, right. And he develops a relationship with a girl who he meets who's carrying around a small baby, which he initially assumes is hers, and she's basically stealing to try to survive. And he finds out that, she's not this child's mother. The mother died and asked her to take care of the baby. And so the two of them end up taking care of this baby together, which has no relation to them. And he ultimately ends up, needing to make money and goes on a very, I guess, dangerous mission to help clean up a lot of I think they said there are 60,000 mines or something like that spread around Japan that they have to go clean up. And so, yeah,
that's kind of a humorous angle of it too, because, right, he's looking for work. Japan is devastated. I mean, the buildings are destroyed there post-war. Looking for any work he can get, he finds out that he can get a job on a boat that is then pulling in the mines that are, scattered out in the sea. And he's told that it's going to be in a well-prepared boat. But when he gets out there,
especially built boat, I think.
Yeah, he realizes, well, the boat's made of wood, and it's this rickety, type of structure there. But then he finds out, well, these mines may have magnets in them, and you don't want those mines drifting into your boat that's made out of metal. So wood is a safety thing. So they kind of sell him on that and bring him on board to kind of pull in these mines.
Well, and that's when he meets some of the other characters who are going to be pivotal in later scenes, including a Japanese scientist who was in the Navy, who is the one who actually is leading up this, I guess, expedition to remove mines and stuff. But no,
Yeah.
it's a great setup. You know, it's like you're interested throughout the entire story, I think, and all the characters are unique and interesting in their own ways. Yeah, I don't know. I really liked the characters, which is, I say once again, that seems to be less common in regular movies now, and was never really common in most Godzilla movies. But this one, yeah, I really liked the characters. I cared about the characters. I was involved in the actual plot, so it wasn't
Yeah.
just a monster movie, and it wasn't. Yeah, I don't know. It
And you
was.
realize that they've all suffered some kind of loss of their own. Nobody is going into this, from a happy place. Everybody is struggling because of what's happened with the war. So things are a little twisted around their working, living conditions, family structures and stuff have all been destroyed. So it's kind of like a hodgepodge of how these families are coming together just to survive. How about the portrayal of Godzilla? Do we want to talk a
Well,
little
yeah,
bit about that?
yeah. He's it's an interesting thing. He's not as big as some of the previous ones. I think he's 55 meters or something like that. Where some of them have been as much as I think 150 meters or something like that. So he's not as big, and he starts out smaller to begin with. In the water, he is scary. I mean, there's also some scenes that also remind me of Jaws. So yeah, when I was reading later, I found out that actually some of the influences for this film was both Jaws and Jurassic Park, and it's like I felt that it wasn't ripping him off at all. There's just something that it captured some of that same feeling from both of those films. When Godzilla came up on land, he wasn't nearly as agile as he was in the water, and he looked a lot more like that traditional 1954 Godzilla rubber suit, not his head and stuff, but his legs and stuff. He's still kind of shuffling and not moving that fast and not that agile, but it was definitely very much reminiscent. And we have to remember this, they consider this the 70th anniversary, even though I think it's technically the 69th or whatever, but it's almost the 70th.
Yeah.
And there was obviously a lot of references back to the original 1954 Gojira movie. And so he had more of that body style of that, and they were trying to. It was definitely an homage to that. This is also, I think, the first Godzilla movie since the 50s, maybe from that original one that really focuses on that post World War II aspect of it. And there's a big element of this. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Japan's
Yeah.
state at that period and everything.
Yes, it's definitely set in that period there, late 1940s, mid 1940s at that point. This film was produced by Toho Studios, and the visual effects were created by Robot Communications. They're Japanese-based companies. So just want to give a little shout out to the people that do the creative work on something like that to make this character come to life in the way that we see him up on screen. I agree that there was a bit of an homage to the earlier films from what I feel were like the 60s and 70s films that I grew up watching on, Sunday afternoon television. The rubber suit, but he had the thick legs and kind of the longer, stiffer neck. He wasn't quite as mobile, but that's kind of what I expect Godzilla. I don't expect him to be a very slick, dynamic type of creature. He's more of a lumbering, causing devastation in his wake type of thing. And I wasn't disappointed by that. I also loved the way that they incorporated the sound that you register as Godzilla's signature roar, that
Yes.
roar with the metallic echo reverb to it. I felt that was something they maybe got a little bit away from in the earlier films that we've seen, the American films here in the US. And I felt that they really nailed going back to the core resonance of it, that identity of it. So I appreciated that.
Right, which they absolutely did do, and they also you keep wondering, are they going to bring back that original Godzilla theme from 1954? And they did, and it sounds better than ever. It really does sounds great.
And that
So
goes a little bit to your Jaws idea there, the fact that they could use that simple, I'm not sure what instrument it was, if it was a tuba or a trumpet or something, but it's that very slow da, 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 type of
yeah,
thing where that
yeah.
something is brewing.
Yeah, yeah. So no, there's definitely a lot of it that's there for the fans, the ones who love the old ones, without but without feeling dated by any means. I mean, it felt modern. It looked. I need to say that Godzilla looked good. He looked really good, and I think he was more agile when he was smaller. When we see him early on in the first island attack, it seems like he was more almost like dinosaur like that. And
Hmm.
more. But I think as he grows, the physiology has to change to accommodate his greater height. Maybe I don't know. Who knows? But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I don't know. It was really good. So, Mark, do you want to talk about any highlights of the film for you?
There were definitely a couple of highlights from a visual effects standpoint that I was excited about when I saw them. They kind of caught me off guard. I mean, you're an adult, you're watching these films, and you say to yourself, hey, what's going to surprise you? But then something like this happens, and you're like, man, they really nailed that. On the visual effects side, there's a couple of scenes. There's one where, they're out in the ocean and they're under the impression that one of these warships, these decommissioned Japanese warships, is kind of come to the rescue and save this little wooden ship from the threats of Godzilla. And you see Godzilla essentially just annihilate that warship with little effort at all. And you are like, wow, he is super powerful. It's the first time you get to see his death ray, I guess. And between the visual effects on that electric neon blue atmospheric effect that they create and the sound design, just awesome. So I thought that was one of the really successfully executed effects. There's another one that kind of combines visual effects and live action that I was pretty impressed with, and that's when one of the lead characters, Noriko, the young woman, she's on a train, going through Japan when Godzilla decides he's going to attack. And this train gets taken off the tracks and lifted up in the air, and it's in his mouth. And as he's like kind of crunching down on this wooden train, she falls through the train, and you see her holding on to one of the grab rails. But it's such a seamless effect going from, digital visual effects to a live action of her hanging up above the
Oh
streets.
yeah.
Excellent.
Well, there's a really
Excellent
interesting camera
execution.
movement. I think it comes up and over and down and then through, and you see her. It was like awesome. It's great.
Yes, so
Cinematography is
well
great on
done.
this film.
How about you?
Yeah.
What were some of the highlights that you saw? I have more, but I mean, I'm sure you
Well,
have
like I
some
say,
too.
the ones that really stand out to me is well, in the beginning, that first scene when we first are introduced to Godzilla, it's genuinely scary, And my son looks over at me at one point. He's like, "This is scary. It's almost like a horror movie." And he had told me, and I reminded him of this, that in Japan this is rated G.
Wow.
And he's like, "That's crazy," because it's PG-13 here. I don't know if that's a true story or not, but he read somewhere that it was, maybe because it's such a part of their culture. But yeah,
Right.
it was actually like on the level of not like horror movie, but on the level of if you saw Jurassic Park the first time in a theater in the dark, it had some scenes that were pretty intense, and this is that same kind of intensity level. So that, and then there were a couple of scenes where just seeing Godzilla in the water, like the one you talked about, where you get to see his scale finally, or there's another
Yeah.
one where he's chasing after them and they're in their boat, and they're dropping mines and stuff and trying to blow them up, get them to swallow one and blow it up and that sort of thing. And it's intense. It definitely has a Jaws feel to it and stuff, but just, I don't know. This, you really felt like you were in a lot of these scenes. You were engrossed, It was,
Yeah.
I haven't seen that in a while. It was really refreshing.
I grew up, like I said, watching these on Sunday afternoon television. My brothers would sit around and watch the TV, and it would be Godzilla versus Mothra and Ghidorah and Rodan and all of these different characters. And back then it was guys in rubber suits, and they used high speed photography and slowed it down to give them these giant leaps and miniatures, a lot of miniatures for the city and the water effects and the boats and stuff. But there was one scene in this film that kind of reminded me of that. Not because of like a low budgetness at all, but it was when Godzilla is in Tokyo and he's destroying the buildings, and you have a couple of the reporters up on a building with their
Yes.
microphones and their shoulder camera, and they're recording it all and narrating it. And they're like, "Oh no, there goes the famous Nippon Theater," as the tail comes down and crushes it, and then their building comes down. just I got a kick out of it because again it was that perspective type of thing where here
Yeah.
these people are, you've got something big in the background there, and it reminded me of that. And I got a laugh out of it. I got a laugh out of it. I don't know if it was intentional, but again, you're going back to like the 40s, and is this the way
Yeah.
people behaved back then? It was just it was a cute way to kind of put that scene as these guys fall off the building, then as Godzilla's kind of wrecking things around them.
Partway through the story, I stopped and I thought, I'm like, I'm really enjoying this movie, but I'm enjoying the story too. I said, not just as a Godzilla movie or as a fan, but just as a movie on its own. It has a really good story. It's well told. The visual effects I thought were great. They weren't perfect, but I think the things that weren't perfect were almost intentionally just homage things. And when you look at it and you realize it only has a $15 million budget. Granted, you're not having to pay these huge salaries to the actors and director and everything else, but I mean, it looks good,
Well,
and
supposedly the actors, the two actors that play Noriko and Kiyoshi, they are apparently big actors in Japan. I think they're in another series together. I've read. Obviously, I'm not familiar.
I think
with
they're
the
married
series.
in that series, but
So they're well known in that area of the world. But here in the U.S., they're new to us, obviously. One thing that we didn't talk about, and this is something that people will feel strongly for or against. It's the fact that it was presented in the native language, Japanese, but it was presented with subtitles. And some people take issue with that. I don't feel any, issue with that. In fact, I'd mentioned it when we were talking about Napoleon, all of these French, portrayal of French historic figures speaking in English. I said I almost would have rather seen them or listened to them speak in French with the subtitles. In this case, we got the authentic Japanese dialogue with the American subtitles underneath it. I think it gave it an authenticity that I appreciated of it being a piece of art from Japan, and I don't have any issue with it at all. But people receive that differently.
So I was a little bit concerned about that too, because I've seen plenty of Godzilla movies that are both translated and have just the subtitles, and so I was a little worried about whether I was going to be able to watch everything that was going on and have the subtitles and everything else too. And so I went in with a certain concern because I knew we were going to be doing a video about it and wanted to make sure I was keeping up with it. But the weird thing is not long into the film, I stopped even realizing that I was reading subtitles, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
You're just watching it, and yes, you are reading the subtitles, but you're not paying attention to the subtitles. You're paying attention to the film and still able to do it. So, and I said, it's kind of weird, I mentioned to my son, he's like, the same thing happened to me. So it's like, yeah, I don't even think about it having been in Japanese and stuff because, your brain just starts translating for you, or making all fit together somehow,
Yeah, it
So,
never felt like it was a hurdle in experiencing the film.
no.
I mean, they were presented with adequate time to read them. The dialogue was not so back and forth that you were trying to keep up with it. It was, paced enough that it was easy enough to do that. I felt it was part of the cultural experience of a piece of art coming from Japan, and I appreciated that. But, other people do have issues when they're like, oh, subtitles, they kind of roll their eyes to it. I didn't feel that way at all.
Yeah. So I did want to talk about a couple of the themes, I guess, there was a lot of focus on that, post World War II and the survivor's guilt and everything else, which I think, was not only, this character, but probably would have resonated with a lot of the people who survived at that time, and so it was, but there's a theme throughout where like one of the people says, hey, I understand, or one of the mechanics on the island says, hey, I'm with you. I understand, when the writing's on the wall, that the war is over, we've lost, does it really make sense to sacrifice your life? And you don't know if he's trying to get him to admit that he, just chickened out,
Deserted,
or if he really
yeah.
was trying to say, hey, it doesn't make sense, but he struggles with this. And then when he goes back home, people are telling him he's a coward, he's a disgrace. And he definitely feels that way. But that he's reminded somehow that his parents told him to live, And the girl that he's with, Noriko, she says everybody who's alive is supposed to be alive for a reason. This theme goes on. Maybe you didn't have to die to still be honorable. And in this story, had he died, he wouldn't have been around to be part of the ultimate, saving of the
Solution,
people
yeah.
in the end.
Yeah.
So, it's trying to say just because you, yeah, I guess survived. You don't necessarily need to feel like you were disgraced. You can still be a hero, and he was. So I don't know. It's a redemption story for him because he had to get to that place where he could finally be willing to sacrifice himself too. I'm
Right.
doing this without giving any actual
he was definitely
spoilers, I guess.
troubled by this throughout the course of the story.
yeah.
The fact that he, essentially was a deserter. Not only was he a deserter, but when the mechanics needed his help to kind of take on Godzilla in those early scenes, he froze up. He didn't help them. A whole, gang of people died because of that. He comes home. His parents aren't alive. There's women there that are saying, hey, my children have been killed because of, your cowardness. So he's really feeling the weight of it there. And I think he feels like I've got to make good on this somehow. So yeah, that's the story that we're continuing, following, wondering if this is going to happen.
He's tortured, but yeah, like I said, it's a redemption story too, So I don't know. To me, it hit all the right points. It felt pretty genuine to me. You were just following a story. I don't know. I really liked it, And when we got out of the movie, I was like, man, that was just a good movie, And I've seen too many movies recently where, I liked aspects to them, but I had issues with them. And this one, I walked out of it and I didn't feel let down. I felt like, man, that was just a good movie.
You know what? This movie was 125 minutes, so just over 2 hours. I know we've had conversations about the length of films recently and how most of them are well over 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 or more. So this was very digestible by, typical standards of what you would expect going into a theater at just a little over 2 hours. So Heath, you mentioned the budget was $15 million, and the initial response to this film, first of all, in Japan, when I went to Japan Society, they were talking a little bit about how well it was received in Japan because it had been out for several weeks prior to the presentation in New York where I saw it. And they said in Japan it had been labeled a masterpiece. It was very well received in Japan. And here in the United States, when I saw it, a week or so ago, it had a perfect Rotten Tomatoes score. You're seeing it a little after me, about a week later. What are your thoughts on some of the reviews that are coming in?
So I was like, well, the people who've seen it initially are probably, more because it was only released in Japan. Yes, they're going to have a bias, but it's probably pretty good, And, but yeah, it had 100% Rotten Tomatoes score with, I think there was like 27 reviews in on it. I'm like, wow, that's pretty good. But they're probably fans if they got to see it early. And then when I saw it, I was like, I have no complaints about this movie. I would absolutely rate this extremely high as well. I mean, honest, it's probably the most enjoyable film I've seen. Definitely one of the top two this year, And so for me, it's like, that's awesome, And so today I checked again and it's at 98% because out of 42, because somebody had to say it wasn't good, probably just so that people would notice them. But I mean, seriously, I can't believe somebody didn't like this film because you don't have to be a Godzilla fan to like this film. It's just good. It's a good all around film. So
yeah,
it deserves that score.
It's a piece of art coming out of Japan. It's very cinematic with the widescreen aspect ratio. The sound was incredible. The visual effects were top notch. I don't have any criticism of that.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen any of Takashi Yamazaki's films before, but definitely it makes me want to see what he's done in the past and what he's doing in the future because this was just good storytelling done well, So I mean, I think it may have a limited release here, and I hope that gets extended because this is one you want to see in the theater, because it's immersive and the sound really makes a big difference with how you're going to receive some of it. But it's just an excellent film all around.
Yeah, I agree. I know several Godzilla fans that are excited to see it. They've been asking me about it, and I didn't want to spoil it for them. I hope the fact that it's presented with subtitles doesn't decrease the amount of people that go out to see it or create any kind of like negativity to it, because I don't think that that should. I think that it's part of the experience of a Japanese created film. I would encourage them to see it and experience it in that format. I would rather see it that way than see it with English dubbing on it or anything. So
yeah. I agree, and I wouldn't always agree, but this one, it was not a problem at all. It just blended in. It was fine. So I don't know. They've already made $23 million on it just in the Japanese release. So it's made its money back. I don't think they spend nearly as much money on marketing in Japan there, so they don't have to make 2 or 3 times as much money, I think, for it to make its money. But I'm sure as it gets released worldwide, it's going to do quite well. It shows we were excited about how much they did with something like The Creator for $80 million. And you think this thing has a fraction of that. Of course, you don't have a lot of the same expenses when it's being filmed in an area where your actors, I'm sure, aren't demanding nearly as large salaries as some big actors do. But really, I mean, it's quite impressive what they accomplished with that on that budget.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the amount of scenes that Godzilla appears in. There are enough scenes that if you're a Godzilla fan, you enjoyed it, but there's a lot of narrative going on that doesn't have it. And I'm sure that affected the budget and helped keep it manageable because there's storytelling going on that's not relying on visual effects. So that may have been one way that they cut it down by, okay, we're going to use all our money, the budget, on the visual effects that need to be, but it's not gratuitous visual effects.
Now, a couple interesting, I guess, behind-the-scenes elements of this is, so this is the first film that Toho has done since 2016, which was Shin Godzilla. And I guess they weren't allowed to release movies within a year of when any of the legendary films were released until 2020. So they had originally planned on, I think, releasing this in 2020, but of course there was the pandemic, so it got pushed back until now. So Takashi actually had 3 years to work on the script, and I think it shows. It was a well-developed script and everything. And I guess I'm glad that for the wait, because I probably made a better film in the long run. I think this will spawn other films. It certainly left a cliffhanger ending that says we'll see more of Godzilla, which is cool.
Yeah, I got to tell you. So I saw it in a theater filled with media press. But at that end of the film, when, it shows that there is a chance for Godzilla to kind of make a comeback and a return, the audience started applauding. They were really behind it, and the idea that there could be a future release with him in it. So that's exciting to think about, that they left it open-ended enough that we could see something else coming out.
I did want to bring up one other point. In both Napoleon and Killers of the Flower Moon, I kind of felt like the directors are now sometimes making decisions based on trying to win another Oscar rather than driving the story for the sake of the audience. And there was no time in this film where I felt that was the case. I think this was all about the audience. I mean, every decision was about trying to give the audience what they want. And I think that's why there's such a high satisfaction level.
Mm-hmm. I think Godzilla, America has its interest and fandom for it, but I think as big as it is here, it's even bigger in Japan. I was reading some press notes that said Godzilla is the equivalent of like Hello Kitty and, a couple of the animated characters and over there. That's how highly, regarded he is as a cultural icon. So I'm not surprised to hear how well it was received there. I think it will be well received. I don't think there's a lot to criticize on it. I mean, you would really have to not be a fan or not familiar with the franchise to find issues with it. I think if you're a fan of that genre and that franchise, I think you're just going to have good things to say about it.
Yeah. Oh, my son's made one other joke about the rating, them rating it G in Japan. He's like, oh, they're rating it G for Godzilla. I'm like, yes.
That could be it. Good. Yeah.
So,
Heath, I want to thank you again for inviting me on your podcast. We've both been eagerly anticipating this film, so it's finally good to sit down and discuss it.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I've been looking forward to this for a while, and I really was looking forward to this conversation. So thanks for coming on.